Hello everyone, it's Shahid here from the Blossom Group. Today we're going to be discussing a subject which is so important to all our particular communities. And I'm particularly looking at minority communities, but also the indigenous and other British and white communities as well. And this question is around, particularly around mental health. And let's see and let's have a discussion about why it happens. So often, what we see, particularly with the communities I just discussed, is that there's systematic and social factors, discrimination and racism, create chronic stress that impacts mental health, economic disparities that a lot of these people, a lot of the people I talked about actually go through, migration experiences, which involves trauma, separation from support systems, stress, all the very difficult things. Departing is very difficult, especially for people who have migrated. And it doesn't have to be migration where they've arrived into the country now, but even perhaps even 40, 50 years ago. It's a very difficult experience to leave a country and then come to the United Kingdom and then try to make it at home. People often talk about, assimilation and integration. It's not the easiest thing in the world. When you're escaping poverty, or you're escaping difficulty, or escaping war, or terrorism, or whatever you're escaping, and you're coming to a country, it's not the easiest thing in the world suddenly to say, there won't be any mental health. There's lots of mental health with people who are coming from other parts of the world, and it's bound to happen. Then you've got the stress, that burden of navigating a society where often people are facing prejudice, and that takes a huge toll. Then you've got the cultural and community pressures, strong emphasis on family honours, community reputations. This is very difficult. I mean, generally we have patriarchal societies which are so difficult to change. Within lots of communities, there's a huge expectation around educational and career success, which creates intense pressure, especially for younger generations. You might have seen the Goodness Gracious Me, where the child has not got a B, and suddenly everyone gets upset in the whole family. Those pressures are real for a lot of people. High expectations of educational, and sometimes it's not that, because it's often based on what parents they want to live their life through their children, and that's often not possible. And the other thing we often have is that this question around gearing everything towards work, whereas you see in particularly in the West and other parts of the world, children are given opportunities to do what they would like. I can't remember seeing many parents, and things are changing now, but in the past we would have said, "Oh, go and find yourself." That wouldn't happen nowadays. It does happen, and that's really important. But go and study what you want, and go and live your life, and go to other parts of the world. That didn't used to happen. You were expected to follow a certain pattern and really raise the family and build the family. Then the other questions came around our historical trauma, around colonialism, slavery, ongoing systematic oppression, having integration impacts on communities. Then there's a huge mistrust of medical systems due to historical exploitation. Even people discuss with us at the Blossom Group, particularly around COVID. A lot of communities don't accept what NHS or Public Health England or other organisations were doing, because there was so many unanswered questions. And this is not about, I've got some sort of theory against um, the those in power, or I'm talking about something which is different. No, it's not that. It's just that these people are asking questions and then not finding any answers. And the other things then are mental health issues are often stigmatized as weaknesses and bring shame to the family. Problems may be attributed to spiritual causes, lack of faith. I was just listening to a Muslim scholar recently, and he was just talking about, it's because of lack of faith that people in the Muslim community have mental health. And I'm sure that's the sort of discussion that happens in other faiths as well, which is really, really sad because there's no stopping these people. People are just, say what they want, and they don't have the knowledge or the experience of what really is happening. Um, Physical symptoms are more acceptable to discuss than emotional ones. So we can talk about things that are happening. And I know within our own communities, we'll talk about what's happening in our families and what's happening in politics. But we're not able to talk about what's happening in our emotional life. Um, no one wants to talk about that. It's so, so difficult. Seeking therapy is very, very difficult. It's a private matter. It's not open to outsiders. We try to hide these things, and it's seen as a almost taboo that if you're seeking mental health support or if you're going to talking therapies, how it's so difficult. Then the language barriers. Many languages lack direct translation of terms like depression or anxieties. It's almost created as a situation where there are beautiful words in our own languages, but we don't tend to find them. We rely on things like, pagal or mad, and that's very, very difficult to deal with within our communities. So we have to ensure that we are using the right words. Not to say that the right words are not there at all. There's beautiful words in our language, and I would say that the languages of the ethnic minorities are far more sophisticated than English could ever be. And that's very, very important to mention that as well. And much, much richer. And so that's very important to mention as well. And the other thing is mental health may be often described through physical metaphors, heavy heart, thinking too much. And even that makes you think, I don't want to really talk about it. Then we come to younger generations, often have different views on mental health than the elders. So that creates huge tensions. A lot of our elders, including myself, often we live in the past. We live in, I would say, rose tinted glasses. We tend to think everything was perfect in the old days and everything now is just wrong and all the young people are wrong, which is not the case. I think the young people have much more different challenges and much more difficult challenges than we ever had. I know we dealt with direct racism, but I think perhaps that was easier to deal with when nowadays it's more indirect and you don't know what's going to happen. So it's very, very important. The other thing is obviously the generational differences. Younger generations often have different views on mental health, and that sometimes causes family tensions. Parents who survive significant hardship often struggle to understand their children's mental health needs. So often what happens is a person who's older who might have gone through something. I'll give you an example. I had a person who I was dealing with recently who had lost his wife in a fire about 10 or 15 years ago. And the focus was really on him and how he's going to cope as a dad. But there was no focus on the children. And everyone just forgot the child. It was like, it didn't exist and they just learned to accept. So that's very, very important for all of our communities to understand. Children, what they go through and what they see affects them all their lives. I often talk about it as a ripple. You know when you throw a little stone in a pond or in the water, it leaves so many ripples, and those are the ripples that we went through ourselves and the children are going through. So it's going to affect them. We can pretend it didn't affect them, but it does. Mental health conditions affect people across all communities, often at similar rates, but I would say that in minority communities, I think they experience them more severely because you're always trying to fit in. The colour always comes up, and there's lots of additional stressors. They're less likely to receive treatment due to stigma, cost, and cultural barriers. When they do seek help, they may face providers who lack cultural competence. Misdiagnosis is more common, particularly for black individuals who are more often diagnosed with serious conditions like schizophrenia. So what do we need to do? We at Blossom Group, we've learned something important. When you bring communities and people together, in things like the Togetherness Cafe, people do want to talk about mental health issues. We learned from a program that we recently delivered called the Ujala Project that we couldn't stop people talking about it. But you do need to create those very safe, confident spaces. Then the other thing to mention, which I think is very, very important, and we tend to forget this, is the invisible community. Not because they want to be invisible, because we made them invisible. It's those not hard to reach communities, it's the one who are ignored. And often these are people without the English skills. So at Blossom Group, we work with huge communities of people who have no English. And the reality is stark. They are routinely dismissed and ignored by mainstream services. This creates a particularly vulnerable group because they cannot navigate healthcare systems, make appointments, or explain their symptoms. Mental health services rarely provide adequate interpretation or culturally appropriate support. They become dependent on family members, often children, to translate sensitive mental health concerns, which adds shame and prevents honest disclosure. Their isolation is compounded. They may be homebound, they might be carers, they're not actually coming out into society and being seen, unable to access information, cut off from both their heritage, culture, and the wider society. When they do seek help, the lack of language support sends a clear message: you don't matter. Which is a really, really sad indictment, but it's really, really true, and this is what we're dealing with. This linguistic exclusion isn't just a practical barrier, it's a form of systemic neglect that leaves some of the most vulnerable people and community members completely invisible to mental health services. Let me quickly turn to another subject, still focusing particularly on mental health. This concept and how religious organizations deal with it. To be honest, religious organizations, which are often central to many communities, particularly minority communities, have just failed to provide safe spaces. I've worked in religious organizations for most of my life, and I've got to say that there is a complete failure to provide spaces where people can talk about mental health, where people can openly discuss mental health. This happens often because mental health is sometimes framed as a spiritual failing, which I talked about earlier. There's a concern about confidentiality and judgment within the tight knit religious groups. There's a lot of judgment. Religious leaders may lack training. Well, I think they definitely lack training, and training itself is not the answer. There's got to be a long term focus in actually supporting and training. And there's no recognition or responding to mental health needs. Often I've worked with people who are religious leaders who have mental health issues, but obviously they do not have the vent to actually talk about it, and nor are they creating any vents. The other thing that we have to think particularly about some of the religious organizations is that we import religious leaders, and sometimes because they're from other countries and other parts of the world, their understanding, particularly when it comes to younger people and what young people are going through in the UK, is poles apart. So we need to understand this, and we've got to create people of all ages who do understand, are able to open spaces and open discussion. So what works? Well, the Blossom Group has proved that things work, creating informal, community-led spaces like the Togetherness Cafes, where people can gather without the formality of judgment they might fear elsewhere. These spaces work because they feel culturally familiar and safe, remove the clinical or institutional atmosphere that can be very alienating, allow people to communicate in their own language at their own pace, build on existing community strengths rather than importing outside solutions. Often the solution is within the communities, but organizations and services tend to look outside. And it's very, very important to recognize that the community has the solutions, but no one's approached them. And then we reach people who would otherwise remain completely invisible to services. One of the things that we particularly do at the Blossom Group and the Togetherness Cafe is people from all walks of life are coming to us. And that's very, very important. You need to create, or we all need to create, a space where people feel valued. They're the most valuable asset of the community. And I often talk about this, that when we dispose of that and when we treat people in such a way that they shouldn't be treated, that's why we often end up with broken communities. The communities and the people are magical and they're there, but it takes important leaders and everyone to understand that we need to come together to support these people to build communities. We often hear the words, oh, coming together. We also hear things around co-production. That's a big word, particularly nowadays with public health. Co-production is not public health and NHS deciding exactly what they need to do and then hold a focus group and then discuss and pretend that's the answer to everything. If the people aren't involved, then it's not co-production. And if the people are not involved throughout the processes, that's not co-production. So that's my message, particularly around mental health. I thought I'd open up the subject and let's see where we go from here. Thank you.